Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be at this conference, and I'm very impressed at all that is around. I'd like to speak with you very briefly about Canada and story of my life. Some of the things that we are doing and working on in Canada. So what I'll do in this very short period of time is give you a little bit about the Canadian context, and then looking at work integration really on three levels. One, looking at what we call the aspiring workforce, and these are people who have been marginalized from the workforce and who are struggling to get into it. Also looking at what we're doing in the workplace and some of the government policies in my very brief 12 to 15 minutes here. So it will be a very quick sweep. So just to contextualize Canada, here we are, second largest country in the world after Russia, two official languages, English and French. And we have 10 provinces and 3 territories. And we have federal and provincial legislation, and health is generally, but not always, at the provincial level. I won't go into the details. You may know our very handsome and much-loved Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who's known for all of the selfies that he takes, and our beloved sport that we share with Russia. And I won't say anything about who's winning. Okay, so now talking about mental health in Canada. Not unlike other nations in the world, 1 in 5 adult Canadians will have a mental disorder in their lives. And this is at a cost of about $51 billion to our economy. That's factoring in everything. And we have historically had a very poor system of mental health with a lot of disorganization and silos and one arm not speaking to the other. So in 2007, there was a commission that was founded, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and it was funded by the federal government to act as a catalyst for improving the mental health system and for changing the attitudes and behaviors of Canadians. And we are now in our 10th year and have now been renewed for another 10 years. And in those 10 years, we've actually, I've been part, in addition to my daytime job at the University of Toronto, I also work with the Mental Health Commission of Canada and was on the Workforce Advisory Committee there. So one of the major accomplishments of the Commission was the development of a national strategy on mental health, which we had not had until 2012. Shame on us. We were probably the last G8 nation to develop one, but we now have one called Changing Directions, Changing Lives, which does address workplace mental health. And in its entirety, it is meant to improve the mental health of Canadians and to create a system that can meet their needs. And it's based on 6 strategic directions, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into today. Looking at mental health and work in Canada, we know that on any given week, more than 500,000 Canadians will not go to work because of mental illness. We know that more than 30% of disability claims and 70% of disability costs are attributed to mental illness. And before I cited a $50 billion figure, but for productivity issues alone, we have approximated about a $6 billion cost in lost productivity due primarily to absenteeism and presenteeism. So this is a very big cost, both economically speaking and socially, and certainly at a humanitarian level as well, which our country is addressing and employers are really struggling with. So beginning with looking at the aspiring workforce, and by the aspiring workforce, we're talking about people who, because of a mental illness, have been unable to enter the workforce, have been in and out of the workforce or who want to return after a lengthy period of time. And generally speaking, these are people with more serious mental illnesses on the spectrum. And unfortunately, the unemployment rates for these people is very high, and the Mental Health Commission of Canada cites about 90%, up to 90% of these Canadians being marginalized from the workforce. So one of the things that we've been looking at really is best practices in helping the aspiring workforce enter and stay at work in meaningful ways. And the research from the United States and from Canada is certainly pointing to supported employment as a best practice. And certainly in the States, there's a large literature on supported employment. We are developing one in Canada as well. And by supported employment, for those of you who may not be entirely familiar with it, we're not just talking about support during employment. We are talking about a distinct model of practice that has a set of principles and practices associated with it, and even has fidelity scales with those practices demarked so that the programs can be assessed in terms of levels of fidelity. And this is, in a nutshell, competitive employment in jobs that people prefer with the level of support they need. We know that in delivering supported employment, fidelity to the model really does make a difference, and there are a number of markers, as I said, including caseload size, the existence of employment specialists who deal only with employment, a rapid job search, which is one of the key principles and probably one of the most controversial principles of supported employment, because many mental health practitioners are of the school of protecting people or not wanting people to go into the workforce and fail because of stress. But in fact, what we know is when people are enabled to get into the workforce and then provided with the training and the support that they need to stay there, the outcomes are far superior than assessing and counseling and preparing and training in advance of entering the workforce. We also know now that there are some things that really help these outcomes improve even beyond what we have found to date. Combining supported employment with social skills training, with cognitive training, including family and peer support, and helping supported employment workers become well-versed not only in mental health issues, but also in workplace issues, because they are in fact marketing and selling their people to employers. And they really need training in business, in public relations, and a very good knowledge of the world of work, even though they may be coming from the health sector. Supported employment outcomes, as I said, are far superior to traditional outcomes associated with traditional programming of helping the aspiring workforce move into employment. And based on 11 high-fidelity studies in a review by Bond, we see that the average employment rate across these studies was 61% for people receiving supported employment, whereas it was 23% for controls, for the control group. The Canadian study that was in there showed a 47% employment rate. So generally, and even since that meta-synthesis came out, other outcomes and other reviews have been put forward, and we are doing our own in Canada now, where we're seeing far superior outcomes in supported employment. Another model is social businesses, and these are businesses that market goods and services to the public, but also achieve social outcomes in doing so because they hire and employ people with mental illnesses. And these businesses are integrated into the mainstream economy. They depend on market income and also government funding in many cases. These jobs can be transitional or stable long-term alternatives to mainstream jobs, and there are about 100 such businesses in Canada for people with mental illnesses. One of the studies that we did to determine how employers view people coming to job interviews from working in a social businesses showed that employers prefer someone to have social business experience over gaps in their resume, over unemployment. But it is not seen to be at equal, on par with traditional environmental workforce participation. One of the long-standing Toronto social businesses is called A-Way Courier. It's been around for many, many years now, and it has helped train other social businesses. It's a courier service that delivers packages and mail to businesses around the city using bicycles and subways. But there are many social businesses in different sectors, bookstores, cafes, gardening services, all kinds of things. Okay, one of the initiatives that we're very proud of is at the workplace level, and that is our Opening Minds initiative. And that is our anti-stigma initiative, where we have gone into workplaces to determine what kinds of programming in the workplace actually combat stigma in the workplace, and to offer a model of anti-stigma intervention to workplaces. The program we use is called The Working Mind, and it's been adapted from the Department of National Defense. And there are two versions that we use, one for managers and one for frontline staff. It goes through a number of modules that you can see, including stigma, workplace accommodations. The manager's version goes through how to recognize employees and talk to employees that might be having trouble at work because of mental health problems. In that program, we draw on this mental health continuum model, which has also been used by our Department of National Defense, where people are trained to look at mental health not through signs and symptoms and diagnoses, but rather we've removed the medical and pathology from this, and we actually talk about colors. And so people are able to identify the color zone that they're in by each of these colors has a set of markers with them, functional markers. And at one conference that I was at, where the people from the Department of National Defense were coming down and sitting at the table and saying, oh, I'm in the red zone today, or I'm in the green zone. And actually they were taking the pulse of their mental health, which they never would have done before, because they were enabled to talk about it using these colors. And it's a very effective model, which also we don't have time to go into. We collect data on our anti-stigma Working Mind programming, and all of our data is showing that stigma has been reduced in workplaces, particularly immediately after the program, but also 3 months later. Another initiative in Canada is our National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. This is a voluntary standard that is meant to fit in with other occupational health and safety standards. It was launched in 2013, and it provides guidelines and tools for Canadian employers to develop psychologically safe workplaces and to prevent psychological harm. And right now, the Mental Health Commission of Canada is doing research on about 15 Canadian companies that are implementing the standard, and the standard goes through a number of key topics. And there are case studies being written up on these companies that are in the process of implementing the standard to identify the challenges, the processes, and the different ways in which the standard can be implemented. The last area that I'm going to talk about is government policies. And we know that there is much more flexibility needed in our government policies to accommodate episodic disability, which mental illness often shows itself as. Right now, people need to declare themselves as ill and unable to work, or well and able to work, but that is not a very good model for mental health, because there's so much variation and episodes in between. We know that we need to link people with employment supports as soon as they enter the disability system, because the longer they're away from it, the harder it gets. We know that supportive relationships with caseworkers are very important, because it's at that point that people can really get angry. And we know that our government system has had many disincentives to work built into it. So when people start to work, often their salaries are, their social assistance is clawed back. They may see their rent supplements being lost. They may lose health benefits. And all in all, it's actually not worth it to work. So we need to be able to reduce those disincentives. And in Canada, some of the things that we're doing now is to make access to policy information easier so that people can actually find out the truth about what does happen. We have embedded peer support into some of the government programs so that when people come into social assistance, they actually get some support from other people who have been through it, who are able to relate to them and tell them how to navigate the system and some of the do's and don'ts. We've changed the earning exemptions so that the salaries are not clawed back as drastically and as immediately. And in some provinces, we've annualized earnings to account for seasonal work and episodic disabilities so that there's more flexibility built into the disability system. Now, access to drug, transportation, and other benefits is not lost as people shift off of the system, or at least not immediately. There's certainly a process that's different now in place. And we now have a system of rapid reinstatement. There was a great fear for people that if they started to work and experience mental health problems, they'd have to get to the back of the line again and wait another year to get onto social assistance. That doesn't happen anymore. People are able to be rapidly reinstated, and that's quite a lot of assurance for people in leaving the system. And also, many of our provinces are now adopting a capacity-focused approach. Previously, people had to spend a great deal of work and energy showing that they were disabled in order to get the benefits. Now, the focus is shifting to look at abilities that are maintained and exist, and to focus on employability and an employment action plan right at the get-go. So, in summary, I would say that for effective work integration, what we've learned in Canada is that programs and interventions are needed at multiple levels. At the level of the individual experiencing the mental health problem, for example, supported employment and social businesses. At the level of the organization or the workplace, for example, anti-stigma interventions, the national standard that we've implemented. And also at the level of government policies. And by that, we're referring to formulating a legislative framework that accommodates and has flexibility for episodic mental health problems. Thank you. How did I do?